So you gotta remember, Star Wars came from nowhere. There was nothing like it. Now, if you do anything that's not a sequel, or not a TV series, or it doesn't look like one, they won't do it. That's the downside of Star Wars, and it really shows an enormous lack of imagination and fear of creativity on the part of an industry.
So, hello there. Kenobi is an interesting new installment to the Star Wars catalog, and the most interesting thing about it is that none of it has to do with its story. And one of the most fascinating things to me is the fact that even though it's quite clear that everyone seems to agree that the series is objectively not so well written, questionably directed, and completely unnecessary, the reactions still seem quite mixed despite this. And when it comes to franchises with bad reputations, such as this, when the new project comes out, there's only two types of reactions a fan can have. The first one is when you enjoy the show and you start to question yourself. Do I enjoy this because it's actually good, or do I enjoy this because I am just happy this is not the worst thing I've seen in a while? The second type of reaction is when you do not enjoy the show and you start to question yourself. Do I not enjoy this because it's actually just as terrible as I think, or do I not enjoy this because I have developed a habit of criticizing every aspect of this franchise at this point? But realistically, you wouldn't get these types of reactions if Kenobi was a follow-up to a movie or a project similar to your original trilogy, would it? If this show was surrounded by a lineup of a good/great projects, no one would even question its incompetence. But within the current context, its mediocrity is blurring a line between good and bad a bit. It's just like a glass half full, half empty question. Do we hate it because it could be better, or do we like it because it could be worse? And while fandom is torn about such an existential question, one thing is clear as a day. They all have watched this show, so...
But then the studios went back to saying, well, we don't trust you people, and we think we know how to make movies. But the studios change everything all the time, and unfortunately, they don't have any imagination, and they don't have any talent. So what are you selling?
There are a couple of factors that play into the success or sort of positive reception of Kenobi, some more obvious than the others. So imagine a scenario. You are a Star Wars fan and you are given two options. First is to completely deprive yourself of any new Star Wars content and sit there in darkness poking Kathleen Kennedy's voodoo doll, or get maybe somewhere around 30 minutes of new exclusive Vader and Kenobi material at a price of 300 minutes of senseless nonsense. Yeah, no matter how much Disney sucks, I think it's obvious what choice people have made regarding this show. And this is a genius move from Lucasfilm because it makes it impossible for fans to actually hate the new material, because the old characters that they loved since forever are the new material themselves. The show is their favorite character. Therefore, the new projects are just faithful enough to their characters for fans to go, oh well, I mean, the series was not good. The story sucked and messed with continuity, messed up the timeline, and was uninspired shit.
Oh my god, I missed this guy. I haven't seen him in 2 years.
From the writing perspective, this is a great way to craft scenes, plots, sequences, and full-on episodes deserving of the high praise and emotional response without bothering to set up those actual story beats in the character dynamics, because those story beats in the character dynamics that they're using as the main emotional gut punch and the heart of the newer projects were set up for them some 20 to 40 years ago. So yeah, it's a win-win situation. The fans get the drama, emotions, and action, including their favorite characters, while storytellers don't get to do anything, really. Kenobi is one of the first cases when Disney has actually listened to the fandom's loud wishes to bring back Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi to the franchise. And I think this decision has a lot to do with Kenobi's success. After so much disappointment and neglect the fans have faced from the Disney side when it comes to their wishes, that when a project comes along that is even tiny bit interested in playing into their wishes without completely trashing it, it might not be enough to make them like the show, but at least it will warm them up to the prospect of enjoying the show, or even watching it. And here's where it's important to draw the line between liking something and enjoying it, because you can definitely recognize the terribleness of the show or a movie while still enjoying it. And I think Kenobi is trying to be just that. But what makes the series case a bit more complicated is the fan service, even though quite present and strong at times, is so few and far in between that it's not enough for fans to fully enjoy it, but for some, it's perfectly enough.
I've been a big fan of Disney all my life, from when I was born. First day at Disneyland, love Disney movies. I look at it as I'm investing in Disney because that's my retirement fund. We've, got a plan for 7, 8, and 9, which is the end of the trilogy, and other films also. So we have a large group of ideas and characters and books and all kinds of things. We could go on making Star Wars for the next 100 years.
Now, I don't want to nitpick every aspect, storyline, or an issue I have for Kenobi, since realistically we would be sitting here forever, and I think there are already hundreds of dedicated videos you can find that already dissects every flaw this series has. My intention is to talk about the show's value in the grand scheme of things, and what context does the series serve in the greater picture of infamous Star Wars franchise. The biggest problem of the show is that its storytelling is heavily compromised by the time frame it is set in, since it cannot afford huge storylines that interfere with the rest of the canon, which renders it quite forgettable and unimportant in the grand scheme of things. But this won't let me be any less critical, since this is a creative decision that could have been avoided, and additionally, somehow, this show still manages to clash with the established story nonetheless. Therefore, we get the story that breaks away from the canon, only to go back to the square one. One of the most interesting things about any story are the character arcs, watching heroes go through life-changing scenarios and come out of them as changed, better people. But the above-mentioned limitations mostly take that option away from Kenobi. Since the trilogy before the show and one right after it perfectly tie into each other, it is highly important for the series that already introduced characters end up in the same exact place and way they're at the beginning of the show. And this is devastating for the story itself because it takes away the ability to have any significant character development. It also messes with ambiguity and unpredictability by completely removing the stakes, since you basically know the ending just by having seen the Skywalker saga.
That was the trickiest thing about this story. Not only is it these huge iconic characters and their legacy characters, but we're in between two trilogies. So we're essentially telling the second act of the story, where we know the first act and the third act, and you know what's going to happen to them.
As much as we'd like to think, and as much as the show tries to convince itself that it is a second act to something, this is not how the stories work. This series simply isn't a continuation of the past trilogy, nor it is a prologue to the next one. In terms of storytelling, this show does not work as an act, but more as an intermission. Therefore, you end up with a show that right off the bat cannot physically offer you any significant character arcs, storylines, or stakes, which is worsened by the show's insistence to have as few original characters as possible. But it doesn't have to be any of those things, right? It can be a fun little adventure story that we can all enjoy. Am I right? Except it's an adventure story that, in my opinion, is about an adventure that can be considered more interesting than the Last Jedi Space Casino storyline, just and only because it has Obi-Wan and Leia in it, with some Vader sprinkled on the top. I think one of the biggest things most fans loved about the universe back in the day was its world and how lived in, raw, real, and huge it felt. It felt unpredictable in a way that excited fans. You could have made a project about droids, aliens, humans, soldiers, magic wizard soldiers, magic wizard alien soldiers that lived thousands of years before or after the original trilogy and still get away with it. The universe was exciting and the options for the future were endless. Well, yeah, that's not the case anymore. The same character interactions are becoming repetitive. The battles between the same two parties becomes repetitive. Inspiring heroic monologues about how bad the Empire is becoming repetitive. Heck, even Darth Vader's badassery is undermined by the sheer amount of times they use it to elevate a perfectly uninteresting new Star Wars piece of media. How many times are they gonna unnecessarily shove Leia into their movies just cause they can, until it becomes simply comical? And this concludes in the universe that we're set to believe is endless, shrinking down into a few planets that can only have enough space to fit around 5 of our main protagonists or their children. So this type of repetitiveness in franchises and ability to escape the same conflicts, storylines, and characters literally cheapens Star Wars to the point where you ask yourself this completely original and not at all a cliche question: is Star Wars actually dying? And to figure this out, we have to first define what it means when we say a franchise dies. It's not really like it's a person that can stop physically existing, because a franchise is an abstract concept that is kept alive by lasting documents signed by Disney executives. So in this sense, no, Star Wars is far from being dead. More so, it's more alive than ever. How does a franchise that, except for some underdog shows here and there, debatably hasn't produced a single objectively great movie since the 80s and has been constantly and continuously disappointing its fans, still get to be this powerful till this day? Well, as paradoxical as it seems, unfortunately, Star Wars' success in terms of numbers is not directly proportional to the fans' satisfaction. You could even argue that it's quite opposite, really. And I think this happens because fans' love for the franchise far exceeds their hate for the corporate BS that creatively exhausted studios are trying to sell them. The heart of Star Wars has always been the concept of hope, and this reflects on the fan base too. The hope that maybe this time, despite the obvious nostalgia baiting, maybe this one will be something that will break the mold and give us something worth hoping for. It is a toxic cycle where even despite the constant frustration and disappointment that the franchise delivers to them currently, the remembrance and the memory of the good times when Star Wars was actually magical and yet unfulfilled potential for greatness is something that keeps the fans hanging on the loose thread. And Disney is aware of this. Hence, the studio uses the reminder that those good times did actually exist as a tool to fool fans into thinking that it might potentially come back once again. And fandom, even though aware of the manipulative baits thrown at them, still stick around in hopes that maybe if they're a bit more patient, the greatness that made them fall in love with the franchise in the first place will resurface once again. And people's disappointment with the franchise over time is getting fainter and fainter since the expectations are lowering and lowering daily. Therefore, fans today are more inclined to enjoy an objectively bad show or a movie not because they don't realize it's bad, but because their standards and expectations when it comes to Star Wars has come close to none. Have you once wondered whose passion it was to create Obi-Wan Kenobi, the show? Whose inspiration? Whose idea? No, you haven't. And even if you have, I doubt you really care about who worked on it. Because Kenobi does not serve as a show. It does not serve as its own entity. It does not serve as a creative outlet to its creators. This entire franchise is no longer an art form, not a genre, not a franchise. It's a merch. You have a source material crafted by George Lucas 40 years ago, and now you have a bunch of uninspired Disney executives that take that original source material, take those original characters, take the old stories, droids, concepts, score, and put them in a pretty neat boxes, package them in a newer, modern way, and sell them as they would sell action figures and Lego sets. And of course, George Lucas used to profit off of Star Wars, but there's a difference between a creator profiting off of their successful creation and a creator only creating stuff to make money off of it. Star Wars has always had this huge merchandise empire, but today Star Wars has become a merchandise itself. Modern Star Wars is no longer a spirited, soulful adventure ride full of originality and wonder. Modern movies and shows crafted by Disney only serve as soulless action figures and Lego sets designed around same source material crafted by George Lucas some 40 years ago. Therefore, even though we can definitely argue that the franchise is doing better than ever in terms of numbers, it is essence and ethos of Star Wars that is taking deathly blows every time Disney releases a new product by being the exact opposite of everything that George Lucas originally stood for. And that is exactly what makes fans mourn Star Wars.
Today, I am proud to announce the Walt Disney Company is acquiring Lucasfilm, the global entertainment company founded by George Lucas and the home of the legendary Star Wars franchise.